Hi guys, it's Michelle, and today's video is going to be yet another Unsolved Mysteries video for you guys. You guys know I love talking about unsolved cases, not just because it's interesting, but also because somewhere out there somebody knows something. They could be watching this video. I don't know. So I think it's cool to help try to solve some of these mysteries. These are some really freaky ones that I found to be super interesting. So let's get into it. The first case that we're going to be talking about is the case of Amber Hagerman. You probably have heard of Amber Hagerman because she is actually the reason behind the Amber Alert, which has saved many children and people in general since 1995. But Amber's story, unfortunately, was very tragic and is still to this day unsolved. In August of 1995, a woman named Donna Norris from Arlington, Texas, was approached by WFAA to film a documentary about women transitioning off of welfare. So the documentary was surrounding Donna, her daughter Amber, and her son Ricky Hagerman. On January 13th of 1996, Donna took Ricky and Amber to visit her parents. Around 3 p.m., Amber and Ricky decided to go on a little bike ride around the neighborhood. Obviously, this was their grandparents' neighborhood. It was a neighborhood they knew pretty well. They would often go to this abandoned Winn-Dixie parking lot. The Winn-Dixie parking lot had a bit of a ramp where they would just ride their bikes up and down it, and they didn't normally go alone. They would usually go with one of their grandparents or their mother, but today they decided to go alone. Ricky was super nervous to be at the parking lot alone because he knew he wasn't supposed to, so he was kind of freaking out and telling Amber that they should go home. So Amber told him that he can go back home and that she would be right behind him. So Ricky headed home, and as he was, coming down the street, approaching his parents' house, he turned around and realized that Amber was not there. Of course, Ricky immediately told his grandpa. They got in his car to go look for her, and all they found was her bike. At 3:18 p.m., the police received a 911 call from a man claiming that he saw a 1980s to 90s black pickup truck pull over and grab a little girl off of a bike, and that she was screaming. And when the police arrived at the scene, Amber's grandfather was already there looking for Amber, and that was when they realized that something really terrible had happened. Immediately after this, Amber's mother, of course, was freaking out. Her child was missing, and she was obviously very distressed over this. She ended up calling Amber's father, Richard Hagerman, told him that Amber had been kidnapped. Because of the structure of the crime, the old man who had seen Amber literally be kidnapped, they knew the car. Police were called minutes after it happened. They wanted to obviously get the news out as quickly as possible, but at that time, there were no such thing as Amber Alerts, obviously. The quickest that they could get the information out was at the 6 p.m. news. Well, obviously, the 6 p.m. news brings us to 3 hours after Amber was kidnapped. Obviously, that's not very ideal, but because of the documentary, there was a lot of high quality footage of Amber they were able to share, and also they looked through the footage multiple times to see if it led to any answers or if they had any creepy men lurking in the background. I also think that a big reason why this case was so big and monumental really was because having video footage of a missing child obviously really, brings that to life more. I also think that this ended up helping a lot with the investigation, identification wise, because obviously a still photo is just not going to be as, accurate as a video footage. As soon as Amber's case hit the 6 o'clock news, they immediately started getting calls and tips from people who had claimed to see her, different information about Amber's disappearance. Richard, Amber's father, was actually a suspect for a very short amount of time because in the documentary they were filming, Donna had opened up about being abused by her husband, Richard. It was very clear that their family dynamic was pretty concerning and that Donna actually had feared Richard. Richard was ultimately cleared because there was security footage of him at a storage unit, and it would have been impossible for him to have kidnapped Amber. At first, Donna actually did believe that maybe Richard had something to do with it, but as soon as she first saw him, after this had happened and he came to the house, Donna just knew in her heart that Richard had nothing to do with this, and he just looked like a heartbroken father. A family friend named Mike Thompson was actually someone who was very actively involved on the case, which someone who's not a family member being so vocal is kind of a red flag for police. It just is. Not only that, but they also discovered that this Mike Thompson character drives a black pickup truck, just like the one that the man claimed that he saw Amber getting kidnapped into. But Mike Thompson was also cleared because he was a delivery man and he was about 30 to 40 minutes away from the crime scene delivering packages at that time, so he was cleared. It's actually widely believed that Amber was actually abducted by a complete stranger because of the way the man who witnessed her disappearance described the way that she was kidnapped. It seemed to him and to police like it was by someone who Amber had no idea who they were, which is really sad because that means that girl was probably absolutely terrified. It was also pretty widely believed that the person who kidnapped Amber was probably still in the area or lived in the area and was familiar with Arlington, Texas. Sadly, on January 17th of 1996, the body of a little girl was found at an apartment complex in a creek. They obviously had to wait several hours before they were able to identify the body, but Amber's family only found out 5 minutes before the media did that the little girl was Amber. Sadly, this case remains completely unsolved. There is definitely a silver lining to Amber Hagerman's case, which was that police really started to realize that had they been able to get the word out sooner about Amber's kidnapping, that things would have gone so much differently. They do believe that getting the word out quicker would have saved Amber's life. Amber's murder left the community of Arlington, Texas very distressed, angry, and of course terrified. One Texas mom named Diana Simone couldn't stop thinking about the fact that Amber was taken in broad daylight and she just disappeared without a trace. I think that that is such a terrifying point. The fact that this little girl was just riding her bike minutes after her brother had left the area just disappears completely. It is so scary. This Texas mom, Diana Simone, actually decided to call the local radio station because she had an idea that an emergency system should be set up so that when 911 gets a call about a missing child, the radio stations would basically be immediately interrupted and broadcast the alert. They ended up calling this Amber's Plan. It was put into place that year, but was later renamed to the Amber Alert. Amber standing for, of course, Amber Hagerman, but also America's Missing Broadcast Emergency Response. Just 2 years later, in 1998, an 8-week-old infant named Rayleigh Bradbury became the first child who was rescued by an Amber Alert. Rayleigh was only 8 weeks old when her mother Patricia left her with a babysitter in Arlington, Texas. When Patricia returned home, she found that the babysitter and her baby were both missing. Police decided to send out an Amber Alert talking about the name of the baby, the name of the babysitter, the type of car that she drove, and within 90 minutes they were able to locate Rayleigh. It was because somebody had heard it on the radio station and they were driving right behind the babysitter's car, so they called in. And since 1998, the Amber Alert has saved over 1,000 children, which is obviously really great. It's so sad that the original Amber Hagerman case is still unsolved to this day. I know that must absolutely be terrifying and so sad for her family, but her family is definitely like seeking peace in the fact that the Amber story has caused so many other children to be saved due to the Amber Alert systems. And if you have any information about anyone involved in any of these cases, I'll have links below of where to send that info. The next unsolved case we're going to be talking about is the Burger Chef murders. So on the night of Friday, November 17th, 1978, in Speedway, Indiana, between 11 p.m. and midnight, 4 employees of the Burger Chef restaurant completely went missing without a trace. Among the disappeared were Jane Freed, she was the assistant manager, Daniel Davis, Mark Flemons, and Ruth Ellen Shelton. Fellow employee came by the restaurant around midnight to visit the other employees. You'll notice that the restaurant was empty, the safe had been opened, and the back door was also open. Police found 2 empty currency bags and an empty roll of adhesive tape next to the open safe. $581 was missing from the safe, and at first, none of the police really took this seriously. They thought that the employees that were missing had just stolen the money and went to party. It was not treated like a crime scene whatsoever because there was no sign of any struggle. It was just thought to be a case of petty theft. And like I said, the police believe that the employees just stole the cash to go partying. Even though the purses and the jackets of the missing employees were left in the shop, the crime scene was ultimately cleaned up and the store reopened like nothing happened. But it ended up being very detrimental because no photographs of the scene were taken. The crime scene was completely fumbled and probably is why the case remains unsolved. When the employees did not reappear the next day and Jane's car was found partially locked in town, that was when the concern started growing. It became very obvious that the employees were actually abducted while closing the restaurant. It was theorized that possibly the employees were attacked while they were removing the trash bags to the cans out of the back door. By Sunday the 19th, hikers found the bodies of the 4 employees in a wooded area about 20 miles away. Jane had been stabbed in the chest, Mark had been bludgeoned to death and died from choking on his own blood. All 4 victims were still wearing their Burger Chef uniforms, and money and watches were all found around them, implying that a robbery might have not actually been the main incentive for this crime. The police quickly came up with a theory that the 4 employees were kidnapped during a botched burglary, possibly after one of the victims recognized the perpetrator. So Mark was actually covering someone else's shift that night, so he was not scheduled to work, so the theory kind of goes that maybe Mark knew the kidnapper since they had not planned on him being there. On the night of the murders, a 16-year-old eyewitness claims that he saw 2 suspicious men in a car outside of the Burger Chef just before closing time. Both were white men in their 30s, one had a beard and the other one was clean-shaven with light-colored hair. Later in 1978, a man in a bar in Greenwood was actually bragging, saying that he was involved in the killings. But after a police questioning, he actually passed a polygraph test denying his involvement, and so the officers were unable to charge him. This man, however, did provide a list of names that he suspected were a part of a fast food robbery gang, and they may have been involved with the murders. Officers actually spotted a man who looked very similar to the bearded man composite of the person who was spotted sitting outside of the Burger Chef right before closing. The police called him in for a lineup, but the night before he was supposed to appear, he actually shaved his beard for the first time in 5 years, which is obviously very suspicious. This man was actually neighbors with someone else who was also on the list for the fast food robbery gang, who matched the description of the light-haired man. This light-haired man was also imprisoned for other fast food robberies, but there was no physical evidence of the involvement whatsoever, so ultimately the police were never able to charge them. After the bearded suspect passed away, his son came forward and claimed that his father was involved with these murders. In 1984, the police actually received a call from a man named Donald Forrester, who was an inmate at the Pendleton Correctional Facility, and he claimed that he was involved with the murders and was willing to confess details to prove his involvement if he were to avoid his transfer to the state prison that was, notoriously way more violent. Donald actually received a court order saying that they were down to make him not go to the state prison if he actually were to confess, and he confessed to shooting Daniel Davis and Ruth Ellen Shelton. He accurately led police to the location of the crime scene in the woods and accurately described the location and the position of the bodies of where they were found. According to Donald Forrester, Jane's brother James actually owed money in a drug deal, and him and 3 other people went to the restaurant to threaten her, but when Mark Flemons stepped in to defend her, a fight broke out and Mark hit his head on the bumper of his car, and they assumed he was dead, which this makes sense because obviously Mark had head trauma, but he actually died from choking on his own blood, which would mean that he wasn't dead at the time. But it's assumed that they believed that he was dead, so they decided to kidnap all of the employees and murder them to eliminate any of the witnesses to the crime. However, once details of Donald's involvement were released, he denied them. He said that he was coerced into making these statements and that he had nothing to do with the murders. Because there was no evidence saying that he actually did have anything to do with the murders, he was not charged, and he died in 2006 at the age of 55 years old. Despite hours of police investigations, the case of the Burger Chef murders officially remains unsolved. I have a few thoughts on this. I think, for one, this Donald confession is probably what happened. I think it kind of makes sense, but at the same time, I just, feel like it doesn't, because I would assume that most people know that, robbery is way less of a crime than murdering 4 people, and even so, murdering the one person is still less of a crime than murdering 4 people. Going in to do a robbery but then ending up murdering people makes no sense to me, but obviously it does happen, so I think that probably is the case. However, again, something that doesn't make sense to me are the watches and the money that was found at the scene of the crime. If burglary had been their main intention, why would they have not taken that money? I would love to hear you guys' thoughts on this, and if you have any information, again, you can use the links below. I do fear that this will probably remain unsolved because I feel like the person who came forward, Donald Forrester, is probably someone, was involved, or at least knows someone who was. All right, the last unsolved case we're going to be talking about today is terrifying, and it is the Keddie cabin murders. This is one of the craziest unsolved cases that I have maybe ever come across. It's just wild. A woman named Glenna Susan Sue Sharp, we're gonna call her because she went by Sue Sharp, and her 5 children, John, Sheila, Tina, Rick, and Greg, all moved into house number 28 in a rural Northern California town of Keddie. They moved in after Sue and her husband James had separated. So they seemed to be a relatively normal family, and on April 11th of 1981, they were hanging out with their friends. Rick was attending baseball tryouts, and Tina and Sheila had plans with the Seabolt family who lived next door in house 27. Sheila Sharp actually ended up spending the night at the Seabolt house. Tina ended up going home around 9:55 p.m. On the morning of April 12th, 1981, 14-year-old Sheila Sharp returned home after having a sleepover at the Seabolt house to a very gruesome scene. Her mother Sue, her brother John, and John's friend Dana were dead in the living room after being bound by medical tape and electrical cords. Tina was completely missing from the home, and the 3 younger children, Rick, Greg, and their friend Justin Smart, who was staying the night, were found alive and sleeping in the bedroom right next to the living room. The initial investigation found that 2 bloody knives and a hammer had been used to murder the victims, and the blood splatters indicated that they had all been murdered in the living room. Sheila and the Seabolt family said that they heard no commotion the night before, despite living right next door. A couple living in a nearby house, number 16, actually claimed that they were awakened at 1:15 a.m. with what sounded like muffled screaming. Tina's jacket and shoes were also missing from the house, so of course that was another point of concern. A toolbox containing various tools was also missing. The house had no indication of any forced entry, and the home's telephone had been taken off the hook, and the cord was cut. The drapes in the living room were also closed. A neighbor, Martin Smart, who was the stepfather of Justin, who was one of the living children from this crime scene, he claimed that one of his hammers had gone inexplicably missing. The head sheriff on the case claimed that Martin kept providing little clues and details. Obviously, the detectives are trained for this, and they said that it seemed like Martin was trying to throw suspicion off of himself. So Martin pretty quickly became the main suspect for the Keddie cabin murders. Suspicion shifted onto a ritualistic or drug trafficking crime, but those theories were quickly dismissed after no drug paraphernalia was found, and there was no other evidence of this. Obviously, besides the main question, like who could have done this, what happened, was where is Tina Sharp? The FBI began investigating this as a possible abduction. But on April 22nd of 1984, 3 years after the murders, a bottle collector found a human skull about 100 miles away from Keddie. Shortly after announcing the discovery of the skull, the police received an anonymous phone call that claimed that the remains that they found were Tina Sharp's. Forensic pathologists actually proved that this was true in June of 1984, meaning whoever called them with this tip that a skull happened to be Tina Sharp was in fact probably involved with or the killer. The most common theory is that Martin and his roommate John were responsible for the murder at Keddie cabin. It was actually believed that Martin and his wife Marilyn were having marital troubles at the time, and Marilyn turned to Sue Sharp for advice about the marriage and confided in her and told her that Martin had been physically abusive, and Sue suggested that she leave him because as a domestic violence survivor herself, that was just what she said that she should do, is leave him. You might wonder why Martin's roommate would be down to do this. He was apparently a war veteran who was suffering from PTSD, and it was also said that he had a crush on Sue, but she rejected him multiple times. The thought of just like rejecting a man being enough motive for them to want to kill you is like pretty terrifying. Following the murders and the breakdown of his marriage, Martin actually moved to Reno, Nevada. Martin began seeing a counselor here, and the counselor came forward in 1981 to state that Martin had confessed to the killings, and his motive was revenge because Sue had convinced his wife to leave him. The Department of Justice dismissed this claim as hearsay, which is like crazy to me, and they didn't look into it any further. A letter Martin wrote to Marilyn also drew attention because of one line in particular. He wrote, quote, "I've paid the price of your love, and now that I've bought it with 4 people's lives, you tell me we are through." Police ruled this out as him talking about the fact that he was sacrificing too much of his time to be with Marilyn, that he was neglecting his other 4 children from a previous marriage. But of course the wording of it is quite suspicious. In a 2008 documentary, Marilyn actually claimed that she found Tina's bloody jacket in the basement after the murders and quickly turned it over to police. There's no record of this happening. Now, is the reason that there's no record of this happening because Marilyn is lying, or because police were trying to cover up the crime? A lot of people believe the police were actually involved somehow with this crime, whether it was simply just covering it up or involved in a deeper way, we're not sure, but the case was actually reopened in 2013. So Special Investigator Mike Gamberg and former Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood reopened the case because they felt like the Keddie cabin murders were completely solvable. During the initial investigation, the Department of Justice and local deputies made crucial mistakes that included excluding evidence that wasn't logged, tampering with the crime scene, and having information about leads that weren't properly investigated. Hagwood states, quote, "It's my belief that there were more than 2 people who were involved in the totality of this crime. The disposal of the evidence and the abduction of the little girl. We're convinced that there are a handful of people that fit those roles who are still alive." Though this narrative was spoken out about that the police had been potentially trying to cover something up, Hagwood and Gamberg seem to be on the case. That was 10 years ago, obviously, and it's been over 40 years since the murders took place, and still today the case remains unsolved. I do think that Martin definitely did it, but like, I don't understand where the connection is between Martin and the police, why they were covering for him, the anonymous caller about Tina's remains. Like, there are so many unanswered questions, and it to me just makes no sense why this case is unsolved, especially because Keddie is quite a small town, and like Hagwood was saying, there are people who were probably involved with this that are still alive. The people of Keddie just have to live amongst these people who potentially are murderers or were involved with one of the most gruesome murders in that town's history. Again, if you have any information, you can go to the description box below to report it. That is it for today's video. If you guys liked it, please give it a big thumbs up. Let me know if there are any other unsolved cases that you want me to cover. But that is it. Make sure you follow me on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, and subscribe for new videos every week, and I will see you guys later. Bye!